Man, has Stasis weapons changed or what? We originally started with Salvation's Grip, which even now, Salvation outside of some quest-related things, still doesn't really have a place. But we eventually migrated to other Stasis weapons such as Cryosthesia 77K, then to Headstone weapons, and then Agriceptor. And the trend so far has actually went from little to no practicality to suddenly being meta. Now, Cryosthesia is an exotic sidearm that Bungie has chose to revisit. And I think it's because of Headstone and the likes of Agriceptor being as good as they are. Headstone essentially just being a trait that can be found on legendary weapons, and then things like Agriceptor having tremendous ease of use as well as lethality. Now, Cryosthesia in the most recent update actually had a removal of its variable trigger completely and will now fire on trigger press instead of release. Also, the charge shot was moved to a special reload. Getting a kill with a sidearm enables access to the special reload, and once the charge shot is fired, the weapon reverts to a standard sidearm fire. This does not cost your entire magazine. Also, the charge shot now deals AoE, which inside of PvE can freeze all those enemies within that AoE radius, and inside of PvP can actually slow players and on direct hits freeze them. Now, these are massive changes to the ease of use here. Cryosthesia before was extremely awkward to use. Number one, that variable trigger where you actually had to release in order to fire threw me off every single time. I mean, we got to a point where we were able to utilize it in the way that Cryosthesia wanted us to, but it just didn't feel good. Another thing that felt terrible was when you would get the freeze off on an opponent, you were then stuck with a sidearm that had no shots to follow up with, which resulted in you either following up with a melee if you were close enough or with a second weapon. Now though, you can essentially freeze and continue shooting afterwards, which is pretty nice. Now, for those that don't remember Cryosthesia, because I know Headstone, Agriceptor pretty much became the focus amongst Stasis weapons, but essentially after getting a kill, you have the option to hold your reload function and obtain that charged shot. Now, direct hits will freeze those enemies, and indirect hits will freeze combatants but slow enemy guardians. Regardless, what's happening, whether or not you are freezing an enemy or just slowing them, is you are applying stasis. And this season we do have an artifact mod called Focusing Lens, which allows the damage there of our light-based abilities to get buffed on targets affected by stasis. What Cryosthesia allows you to do is to self-proc Focusing Lens for whatever your light-based subclass build is. I'm using things like mini hammers. This elevates the damage tremendously, especially with things like Roaring Flames ×3. And this buff here with Focusing Lens carries over inside of PvP as well. You can essentially freeze opponents and then follow up with a light-based ability to finish them off easily. And this ability to self-proc both inside of PvE and PvP is really nice. It's the same reason why I told many of you to go for the Zephyr Sword with Cold Steel, which too allows you to apply stasis to enemies. But in my opinion, what makes things like Cryosthesia and Agriceptor and pretty much all of these stasis-based weapons that can apply these stasis effects is really its ability to synergize with our stasis subclasses. I know we've already tested Shadow Dive and we talked about how Shadow Dive is essentially nerfed, and it is. However, what's not nerfed is the Cryosthesia Shadow Dive method, which by the way, you can do. You can freeze an opponent with Cryosthesia and then follow up with your Shadow Dive ability and get the Shadow Dive kill. Granted, you got to have direct hits there to get the freeze off, but as long as you get the freeze off on one of the targets, if they're grouped up with another target, even if you don't get the freeze off on them, just the shatter damage will kill the other target. So in my opinion, even though Focusing Lens and that buff there with light-based subclasses is really nice, it's the synergy there with our stasis subclasses that makes it so deadly to me. The ability to dip into fragments like Whisper of Chains and Whisper of Rhyme, or for Warlocks, Ice Flare bolts being procced after destroying frozen targets, spawning those Seekers, chaining freeze to freeze. And I know you've seen these exact same things being done with Agriceptor. Cryosthesia essentially allows you to do it without consuming special ammo, as this is just a primary weapon. What's so good about it is being able to chain those stasis abilities one target to the next, getting a kill inside of Crucible, proccing that charged shot, moving to the next target, and then applying that stasis to then follow up with whatever you want to follow up with. Now, I used to like to rock a grenade launcher with Cryosthesia just because it normally is easy cleanup, and by easy cleanup, it does just enough damage to leave my opponent one shot. I love that it keeps them at roughly 40 health after I apply a grenade launcher shot to them, so that I can easily clean up with the sidearm to then proc another charge shot to go to the next target. I think the mini hammer was probably the most interesting one here, as with Focusing Lens and things like Dune Marchers, I would essentially throw a hammer out, hit the target with the hammer, linear actuators would disperse, chaining that lightning damage to nearby targets, and once we get the stacks of Roaring Flames piled up, it's easy one-hit kills from there. Now, is Cryosthesia going to change the game? Is it going to suddenly become the go-to sidearm for PvP? Guys, when I think of the best sidearms, exotic sidearms that is, in terms of ease of use, like hands down being the best 1v1 sidearm Sidearm, Traveler's Chosen is still the best to me. That weapon just has some of the best target acquisition amongst all sidearms. And then right next to it is Devil's Ruin. Now, Devil's Ruin is so good because of its ability to essentially become a fusion rifle, right? A little mini fusion rifle. Cryosthesia, although functionality-wise, makes it a great option for stasis users and self-procking things like focusing lens. However, the weapon does have some drawbacks in 1v1s. I also find that it has poor in-air accuracy, and even though things like Devil's Ruin, Traveler's Chosen, those weapons are both exotics as well, so they don't have things like Icarus to help them with that in-air accuracy, but they fare better than that of Cryosthesia. Cryosthesia, if you take to the air sometimes, you'll notice your shots just absolutely blank. So it's not that Cryosthesia isn't a good weapon based on its exotic traits, its perk, its catalyst combination. It's good in that department. It has functionality. Where it lacks to me is just in its ability to duel. That's just my personal opinion. Now, there were times that it absolutely shreds. It just really requires you to keep your butt on the ground, which is kind of unfortunate because you're rocking a sidearm. And 9 times out of 10, you have a shotgun user that's rushing you. So the first reaction you have is to jump to the air, to get away from that ape. Unfortunately, what may happen is you'll jump away, you'll try to land your shots, they'll deviate, and then the shotgun rusher just cleans you up when you come back down. So if I had to like rank exotic sidearms, right now, Forerunner is the best, Traveler's Chosen is under that, then it's Devil's Ruin, Cryosthesia, then Rat King. Purely based on the sidearm's lethality inside of PvP. And then inside of PvE, Cryosthesia definitely takes an edge on those if you are taking advantage of Stasis. So guys, those are our thoughts on Cryosthesia. Is it a hell of a lot better than what it was before? Functionality wise, yes. This weapon was pretty much dead to many of us. Like there was a moment there that we gave it a shot. We were like, all right, let's try this thing out. And slowly but surely with the inclusion of Headstone, Agarceptor, and now Zephyr, there's just too many other options that were surpassing that of Cryosthesia. However, where Cryosthesia sits now, I can see why someone will use it. And with the ability to self-proc things like focusing lens while only consuming primary ammo and the ability to carry that stasis charge from one target to the next, it has a place, or at least until focusing lens goes away next season. Again, the biggest benefits to Cryosthesia and all these stasis weapons, in my opinion, is its synergy with stasis. Play around with those subclasses. Find ways in which you can shatter after shooting off that Cryosthesia charge shot. You'll be amazed how well things synergize here. So guys, let me know in the comments below what you think. It's good of Bungie that they revisited this weapon, and they spoke about it before in the podcast too, that they were scared how good Cryosthesia was going to be, hence why it shipped a little underwhelming, which happens sometimes. Sometimes Bungie ships something too hot, and other times they ship it a little limp. I think Vex Mythic Class, Cryosthesia, both of those in their original form is a great example of that. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.